Talk button when y'all go to talk.
Good morning, everyone. If you don't mind, will you please stand when we do the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good morning, everyone. I now call the Subcommittee on Rural Development, Energy, and Supply Chains to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. The committee is here today to hear testimony about the role of small businesses in our domestic energy production and the regulatory hurdles drillers and service providers are facing today. I want to thank you all for being with us here today, and I'm looking forward to today's conversation. I now recognize myself from opening statement. First, I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. This morning, I understand you traveled pretty far to be here, and we appreciate your time. This is a very important issue. It's near and dear to my heart, being in Houston, the energy capital of the world. The energy corridor is in my district, makes me the energy congressman of the entire world. I tell myself that every morning when I wake up. Makes myself feel better. We've had an issue with the oil and gas industry, I think, for the last couple of years. We're seeing gas prices soaring, and I think it's time for us as a country to unleash American energy. I've spoken to many of you in person, and no one has an issue with renewable energy. No one has an issue with the next abundant, affordable source for the future. But I think we have an understanding that we cannot get there without us. Domestic oil and gas is the lifeblood of our economy. And when American energy production is strong, our country is strong, our allies are strong, American families are strong, the world is a stronger and a better place. Independent oil and gas producers are feeling the negative impacts of regulatory hurdles every single day. It's not just the regulatory issues, it's also the higher tax rates that we are paying, and sir, you will discuss that here in a little bit. A recent example involves around BOEM's institution of a new rule in June regarding the capital reserve requirements for outer continental shelf oil and gas leases and grantees. Requirements such as having an investment-grade credit rating, which are large upfront expenses for any small business, place additional burdens exclusively on smaller offshore oil and gas companies. BOEM's rule further tips the scale in favor of large companies, and small businesses lack the same luxury of access to capital and credit. Another rule we'll focus on today is NOAA's Rice's Whale Rule. I'm not going to have Nessie today. Don't worry about that. Which places undue burdens on offshore operators. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's expansive rule about the Rice's whale limits oil exploration and dramatically increases costs for producers in the Gulf. This rule contains numerous anti-oil and gas provisions, which the sole aim of dismantling our country's offshore production. All over a possible sighting of a Rice's whale almost a decade ago. As a candidate for president, Joe Biden made a campaign promise to end fossil fuels. As president, his administration has worked every day to do just that. As I said earlier, it's not about ending our industry. It's about finding ways to unleash American energy. We need more electrons in the world, not fewer. I represent Congressional District 38 here in Texas. As I told you, I'll probably say it 3 more times. Energy congressman of the world. It's something that's very important to me. And if you're looking at the international and the safety of the world, is literally relying in the hands of energy production. Look at what's happening in Russia and the Ukraine. Look at what's happening all over the world. We have the opportunity to lift nations and countries out of poverty by just giving them American oil and gas. But these oppressive rules and regulations are being forced upon our domestic oil and gas producers, and are crushing production, future investment, and the benefits that American consumers could enjoy if we were energy dominant once again. And I'm confident that we will get there. It's my opinion that the word transition is a myth. There is no transition. It's only energy addition. Over the course of the next decade, we're going to add 2 to 3 billion more people to this earth. Last year, we had the highest demand on earth for oil and gas. And being from Houston, and that Houston heat, I'm not going back. I will continue to turn on my air conditioning. Otherwise, I will not be very comfortable in Houston at all. We should be talking about energy addition, not transition. And again, this is an all-hands-on-deck approach. I want to thank you all for being here this morning. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you for your time. I look forward to having a very spirited debate and discussion. I now recognize Ranking Member Ms. Gluesenkamp-Perez for her opening statement. And thank you, ma'am, for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The success of our small businesses and the economic security of working families relies on abundant sources of affordable energy. As we all know, the high cost of oil and gas over the past 18 months has caused significant financial distress to many families, particularly those in rural communities like mine where we have to drive significant distances to access simple services. That's why I am supportive of efforts to make our nation more energy independent and take advantage of the wealth of natural resources available to power our economy long into the future. Unfortunately, many of the sources of energy that we rely on are vulnerable to foreign manipulation. Just 2 weeks ago, we saw Russia and Saudi Arabia collude to continue production cuts through the end of the year. As a result, oil prices spiked. And despite the record amount of oil being produced in the U.S. right now, gas prices remain elevated for most of the consumers. This is because the price of oil is set on a global market. It is a global commodity, and no matter how much is produced at home, it will still be vulnerable to manipulation by dictators and despots abroad. But what is clear is that while we transition to more sustainable and cost-effective renewable energy, we still need oil and gas in the meantime. One potential source of oil and gas is found off our shores. Unfortunately, the process of extracting it comes with significant trade-offs, particularly for coastal communities. We know that as an offshore As offshore oil and gas infrastructure ages, it can corrode and release harmful chemicals into the water. Idle and unplugged wells can leak oil that is toxic to fish, shellfish, and marine life, harming local fishermen and rural economies. In the event of large spills, oil can reach the shore, polluting beaches and threatening coastal tourism. One study found that the Deepwater Horizon spill cost tourism and fishing industries in Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida between $15 and $30 billion. This is why I opposed offshore drilling off the coast of Washington, and my first amendment as a member of Congress was to prohibit drilling off the shore of Oregon and Washington that would adversely affect our fisheries. We're here today to discuss new actions by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, to better understand these trade-offs, to both protect coastal communities and shield taxpayers from incurring additional costs when oil companies that drill offshore go bust. New proposed financial assurance regulations would require oil and gas companies to conducting business offshore to cover the cost of decommissioning up front in the event their companies go bankrupt. While decommissioning wells is already required by law, companies often seek to shirk their duties to do so. As a result, it is taxpayers who are often left with the expense. According to the GAO, the Department of Interior held less than $3 billion in bonds to cover the estimated cost of $38.2 billion for decommissioning these wells in 2015. While I sincerely sympathize with the concerns of my colleagues that this could negatively impact independent oil producers, it is essential that our regulations address the real cost of offshore drilling and ensure those costs are borne by the companies that profit from the practice, not taxpayers and coastal communities. I hope this regulation will adequately protect coastal communities from any downstream consequences of offshore drilling. With that, I thank all of the witnesses for joining us and look forward to a productive conversation. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, ma'am. I know, where am I at? With that, I'd like to recognize our full committee chair, Mr. Roger Williams from Texas, for his opening statement.
Thank you, and good morning to all our witnesses. We appreciate you being here today. I want to thank Chairman Hunt for holding today's hearing, and we greatly appreciate all of your time. You know, it's no secret that the Biden administration has been at war with oil and gas industry since day one. Countless regulations have created a burdensome environment for our nation's small oil and gas producers that are a critical component of our domestic energy supply. Some of the regulations that we will be discussing today are a continuation of this trend that is doing nothing but crippling and harming our independent oil and gas producers. Our small businesses across every industry are the engines of our economy, and without them, America will struggle and has struggled. Requirements like attaining an investment-grade credit rating are expensive and put small businesses at a competitive disadvantage. So as Americans are facing stubbornly high inflation and energy prices, we need to be making it easier, I repeat, easier, not more difficult for domestic energy companies to succeed. I look forward to hearing from our witness today. And with that, Mr. Chairman Hunt, I want to thank you again, and I want to thank our witnesses for being with us, and I yield my time back.
Thank you, Chairman Williams. At this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses that are with us today. Our first witness is Mr. Mike Manorevic. He's the CEO of Arena Energy, co-founded by Mr. Manorevic in 1999. Arena Energy focuses on pursuing the lower risk exploration and production opportunities that remain in the Gulf after 50 years of drilling by larger oil companies. Since the company started in 1999, it has invested over $7 billion in the Gulf of Mexico and has paid production royalties of over $1.4 billion to the U.S. Treasury. Mr. Manorevic is a graduate of the University of Texas in Austin. We had a pretty good football season this year, sir. Earned his Bachelor's of Science in Petroleum Engineering. Mr. Manorevic, thank you so much for joining us today. Greatly appreciate it. We'll look forward to your testimony, sir. Our second witness is Mr. Paul Danos, serves as chairman of the board for NOIA, the National Oceans Industries Association. Founded in 1972, NOIA represents all facets of the domestic energy-related industries. Mr. Danos was reelected as chairman of the board this past May. Mr. Danos is also the owner and CEO of Danos LLC, a family-owned and managed energy services provider. He joined the company in 2005 and has been the co-CEO through 2020. Mr. Daniels graduated from Louisiana State University with a Bachelor of Science in Finance and then went to Stanford University Graduate School of Business, where he earned his MBA. Mr. Daniels, thank you so much for being here today. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. My third witness is Mr. Alex Epstein. He is a philosopher, journalist, and author that has covered the energy industry for over 2 decades and is the founder and president of the Center for Industrial Progress based in San Diego, California. The Center for Industrial Progress was founded by Mr. Epstein in 2011 to offer a positive pro-human alternative to the green movement. He is the author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, a New York Times bestseller arguing that human flourishing and progress requires the use of more fossil fuels, not less. Mr. Epstein has spoken to employees and leaders at dozens of Fortune 500 energy companies, including ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Phillips 66. He has also made his moral case for fossil fuels at dozens of campuses, including Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Duke. Mr. Epstein graduated from Duke University with a Bachelor's of Arts in Philosophy. Mr. Epstein, thank you, sir, for being here. Greatly appreciate your time. I now recognize the ranking member to introduce the minority witness for today's hearing.
I'm pleased to introduce our final witness today, Ms. Kathleen Nisbet-Monsey. Ms. Nisbet-Monsey is a native of Willapa Bay in my district, where she is a second-generation oyster farmer, working as chief organizing officer at her family's business, Goose Point Oysters. She grew up in the family business farming oysters and working in the processing plant before attending college at the University of Hawaii Hilo, where she studied marine biology and Spanish. After college, she returned to her family business and has worked there for the past 15 years. Throughout her time working for Goose Point Oysters, she has worked with a variety of organizations, such as serving on the board of the Pacific Coast Shellfish Growers Association and establishing the Willapa Bay Grays Harbor Ecosystem Collaborative. She is currently the president of the Willapa Bay Grays Harbor Growers Association, with a mission to uphold the legacy of environmental stewardship and water quality through sustainable shellfish farming. Thank you, Ms. Nisbet-Monsey, for taking the time out of your schedule and traveling all the way to D.C. to testify today. We are truly honored to have somebody that really works for a living and represents their community in the best ways. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, ma'am. Before I recognize the witnesses, I would like to remind them that their oral testimony is restricted to 5 minutes in length. If you see the light turn red in front of you, it means your 5 minutes have concluded and you should wrap up your testimony. And I recognize Mr. Manarovic for his 5-minute opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Hunt and Ranking Member Goosenkamp Perez, for the opportunity to testify this morning. My name is Mike Manarovic, CEO of Arena Energy. We're an offshore exploration production company focused on the Gulf of Mexico, one of the most active drillers in the Gulf of Mexico. Over the past 24 years, as Chairman Hunt mentioned, we invested $7 billion in the Gulf and paid the federal government over $1.4 billion in royalties. Last year alone, we paid the federal government $230 million in combined royalties and corporate taxes. I also speak to you today on behalf of the Gulf Energy Alliance, as a coalition of independent Gulf producers. Although we're not household names, independents are the backbone of the offshore industry, producing 35% of the oil and natural gas from this basin. I'm here to discuss a new regulation recently proposed by the Department of Interior. This hearing is the appropriate place to discuss this issue, as the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, also known as BOEM, stated that 76% of the businesses operating offshore are defined as small businesses. This totals 407 businesses, according to BOEM, and this rule poses an existential threat to those companies. Also, the SBA Office of Advocacy has submitted a very strong letter denouncing BOEM's proposed rule. BOEM repeatedly states that the goal of this new rule is the protection of the American taxpayers from exposure to financial loss associated with offshore decommissioning. We firmly believe that it is primary responsibility of the current operators to abandon their platforms and wells, and that taxpayers should never be responsible for abandonment obligation. ARENA and GEA are willing to work with BOEM to find a solution to achieve that goal. But this rule, as currently drafted, is a massive overreach to a limited problem, is devastating for small businesses, and is completely unworkable in its current form. BOEM states that the cases where taxpayers have actually paid costs for decommissioning are rare, and that since 2009, more than 30 corporate bankruptcies have occurred involving offshore oil and gas leases with unbonded decommissioning liabilities of $7.5 billion. Those are big numbers. So how much has been paid by the American taxpayer for the abandonment obligations in the Gulf? Well, that wasn't addressed in the rule. But in July of 2023, BOEM communicated to the House Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources that U.S. taxpayers have incurred obligations totaling $58 million net of bonds. $58 million total after more than 30 recent bankruptcies. Again, the American taxpayer should never pay for offshore abandonment obligations. But to put this in perspective, in the last 20 years, offshore oil and gas production has generated $124 billion in royalty and lease bonuses for the U.S. Treasury, $6 billion a year, $500 million a month on average. And how has the taxpayer been protected? By law, by regulation, and by practice. All current and previous owners stand in front of the taxpayer and remain collectively responsible for decommissioning obligations. Selling a property in no way relieves the previous owner of its continuing decommissioning obligations. To address the $58 million in taxpayer exposure, BOEM now seeks an additional $9.2 billion in new bonding, which would cost small businesses in the Gulf $5.7 billion over the next 20 years. Those are BOEM's own numbers. We feel they're much higher than that. That money could be used to invest in projects and actually decommission these platforms and wells. Overkill barely begins to describe BOEM's solution. But you don't need to believe an oil and gas guy. The comment letters have been submitted. This is what the state of Louisiana said. The proposed rule falls within the unpleasant category of a solution in search of a problem. In reality, there is no problem within taxpayer-funded decommissioning. There's certainly no problem that would justify eviscerating the oil and gas industry. The SBA Office of Advocacy said that BOEM's analysis intentionally ignores joint and several liability as the way that the taxpayers are protected from these unfunded liabilities. It presumes that small businesses impose a significant risk to the taxpayer despite the full backing of companies that BOEM has already exempted. As a result, small businesses are not only disproportionately harmed by the proposal, but only small businesses are harmed by the proposal. And the Surety and Fidelity Association America, which is a trade organization of more than 400 companies that writes 98% of the surety and fidelity bonds in the United States, and are the group that the BOEM is looking to solve this problem, what do they say about it? They fear that the proposed regulations might have unforeseen and possibly negative consequences, leading to an uptick in bankruptcies among small independent operators, ultimately worsening unfunded decommissioning liabilities. Such financial failures will have cascading negative impacts that undermine BOEM's stated purpose for increasing access to these bonds and alleviating the burden on the taxpayer. Given the increased risk in the market created by recent bankruptcy rulings, the proposed regulations could have an even stronger chilling effect on the surety industry's appetite to participate. As is, players are already exiting the marketplace, further exacerbating capacity concerns. This rule is not workable. The group they're looking to for a solution says it won't work. Additionally, CAC Specialty, which is a surety bonding brokerage firm, said, like a Greek tragedy, the BOEM's actions could expedite the outcomes that it wished to avoid. And once again, the state of Louisiana said, indeed, it is Louisiana's view that supplemental bonding is unnecessary. As long as a creditworthy party exists in the chain of title, there exists no meaningful decommissioning burden on the federal government. The solution resides in the BOEM's own analysis. The proposed rule states that if BOEM were to take into account the financial capacity of the predecessor lessees, the financial burden on small companies would be substantially reduced compared to that resulting from the proposed rule. And this would mitigate the impact of the proposed rule on small businesses. We remain optimistic that we can work together to create a sensible solution that truly protects the taxpayer and maintains a strong and viable small business community along the Gulf Coast. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Menarvic. I now recognize Mr. Daniels for his 5 minutes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Hunt, Ranking Member Glusenkamp Perez, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for having me here today to testify. Again, my name is Paul Danos. I'm President and CEO of Danos LLC. We're a 76-year-old family business headquartered in South Louisiana. I'm also the chair of National Ocean Industries Association, which for more than 50 years has represented all segments of the offshore industry, including oil and gas, offshore wind, offshore minerals, and offshore carbon sequestration. So in 1947, my grandfather started our company, and he had one partner. So there was two of them. That's definitely a small business, and most of the work happened at my grandmother's kitchen table in a boat offshore. They sort of took turns between the table and the boat offshore, and we've done a pretty good job of preserving history. We put a book out kind of capturing some of our history last year in the 75th year anniversary, and there's some great stories about why our founders of our company started this business. And it was certainly, like many entrepreneurs, they wanted to better themselves. They had an opportunity to do that, but also for their extended family and their community. And that is the fabric of our economy and so many small businesses, people who take a risk. My grandfather borrowed $2,000 from his sister, bought a boat and got started and took that risk and provide jobs to people in an industry that provides just an amazingly valuable service. The innovation and the quality of life that we enjoy because of the affordable and reliable energy that comes from oil and gas and woven into that fabric of our small business and so many others. So today I'm here. Our footprint has grown in our company. I'm representing my family and certainly our employees for our business, but the employees for our industry, which total about 370,000 direct and indirect employees for the offshore oil and gas. So I bring a message from those employees. I spend time at crew changes and offshore locations, some of our land locations, talking to our folks. And kind of two things that I would like to convey on behalf of our people in our industry is first, I hope you realize the massive impact that the regulation that comes out of Washington has on the people on the front lines heroes who are providing that reliable and affordable energy for our country. And I know sometimes we can get disconnected, and it's words on paper, and it's legislation, and it's regulatory acts. But at the end of the day, we're talking about real people on the front lines who are making this work happen. So I represent them, and just want to again make sure that we understand the impact that happens on families, on people. And then the second thing is just. When we talk about any policy that limits the production of oil and gas here in the U.S., I would say that's bad for our country. We have some of the lowest carbon intensity barrels in the world produced in the Gulf of Mexico. An ICF study that came out recently said that the average carbon intensity of barrels produced in the Gulf of Mexico are 46% lower than the average of the rest of the world in terms of carbon intensity. So when we restrict supply here in the Gulf, and we have to understand something about oil and gas demand and the way it works. It's a fungible resource. It's abundant around the world. So if we restrict supply, it's sort of like squeezing a balloon. That supply will show up somewhere else, and it'll be produced somewhere else. And most often, it's going to be places like Venezuela, Iran, Russia. So what we're going to do is we're going to send those barrels there, and those are higher carbon barrels. So it's a negative impact on the world's environment. We also send those jobs somewhere else, right? Back to those guys, those people, men and women on the front lines. When we restrict supply here in the U.S., we're sending those jobs. We're sending the royalties that Mr. Menarbic talked about, $6 billion in royalties every year. We're sending those to other countries, and then we're giving up our energy security at the same time. So there's the idea of moving barrels outside of our country, producing them elsewhere is bad policy. Limiting production here in the U.S. is bad policy. So what do we need? We need good regulations. Part of why the barrels that we produce in the U.S. are low carbon barrels is because of the way we produce. The regulations that we have worked together with industry and regulators over the decades that are common sense, that protect our environment, protect our people, protect our coast. I'm from a place called Cutoff, Louisiana. It is a coastal South Louisiana community. I grew up fishing and enjoying the coast. Some of the best places to fish are around platforms and old platforms. I had my daughter and my wife in the Gulf of Mexico fishing at an old platform early this summer. We had a fantastic experience. So we can coexist environmentally, but we need common sense policy. We need a regulatory environment that promotes good common sense regulations and policy that protect our environment but encourage domestic production. So I look forward to the conversation that we'll have today and any questions that we have going forward. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mr. Danos. I now recognize Mr. Epstein for his 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So my name is Alex Epstein. I'm a philosopher and energy expert, representing only myself, and everything I say today is my own independent conclusion, not influenced by anyone from any industry, including the fossil fuel industry, but which I am a very big admirer of that industry for reasons you'll see. Because energy is a major input in every business, the lower cost and more reliable energy is, the lower cost and more reliable everything is. The higher cost and less reliable energy is, the higher cost and less reliable everything is. And the less efficient and less competitive U.S. businesses are, including small businesses. Today we're hearing how irrational policies are crippling one crucial area of the energy business, offshore oil production, which provides almost 1/6 of our domestic oil production. Production without which gasoline would be far more expensive, and I'm from California where we're around $7 right now, and it would be far, far less secure. So it's really crucial to have this production. But today I'd like to put the irrational attack on offshore drilling in its broader context, which is that it's just a tiny piece of today's rabidly irrational global anti-fossil fuel agenda, an agenda that poses as rational and scientific, but is actually the exact opposite. So the dozens of discrete attacks of the Biden administration on the fossil fuel industry, they're not isolated incidents. They're all attempts to impose an agenda that says fossil fuel use must be essentially eliminated by the year 2050, which is now very, very close. At the beginning of his administration, President Biden announced a U.S. whole-of-government approach to climate change, which in practice means an overarching commitment to rapidly eliminate fossil fuels. Every agency was told, figure out new ways to attack fossil fuels. And that's what they've done. The Biden administration is systematically committed to attacking fossil fuels on 4 fronts. So the first front of attack is fossil fuel investment. Fossil fuel investments are long-term commitments that require confidence in a payoff. Our government, often colluding with activists, incessantly discourages fossil fuel investments directly and by threatening the industry's future, like running on, I guarantee you we're going to end fossil fuel, and then being elected president. The federal government has been a major driver of ESG anti-fossil fuel climate policies, with regulators pressuring financial institutions to declare their commitment to getting off fossil fuels. The SEC's recent climate disclosure rules, so-called, are taking the damage to the next level. Now, front 2 of the attack is on fossil fuel production. So punishing restrictions and onerous taxes, specifically on fossil fuel production, are common across developed countries, unfortunately, and these suppress supply from the freest nations on the globe. And unfortunately, we're leading this right now. One of the many punishments President Biden has inflicted on the supposedly preferred fossil fuel industry, which the opposite is true, was his early moratorium on issuing oil and gas leases on federal lands. And the Biden administration continues to delay and decline holding lease sales. Now, the third front of the attack on fossil fuels is fossil fuel transport. One of the most effective ways of punishing the fossil fuel industry has been attacking critical transport infrastructure, including pipelines and export/import facilities with delays, regulations, and lawsuits. Now, we all know about Keystone XL, which has been hugely destructive. But perhaps the most destructive way of singling out fossil fuel transport for punishment has been killing natural gas pipelines. We have a virtually limitless supply of natural gas in this country, particularly in Appalachia, and we have an incredible ability to ramp up production quickly. But we are blocking pipeline after pipeline. Now, the final front of the attack on fossil fuels is punishing fossil fuel use. So our government's whole-of-government attack on fossil fuels seeks out every way it can to punish fossil fuel use. Perhaps the most destructive and under-discussed form of this is punishing reliable fossil-fueled electricity generation and thereby destroying our grid. So as a Californian, I am well aware of the costs of punishing fossil fuel electricity generation. Gavin Newsom and others prematurely shutting down vital fossil fuel plants led to devastating statewide blackouts in 2020. And 5 days after pledging to go all EVs by 2035, Newsom told us there wasn't enough power to charge our EVs. From his administration, avoid using major appliances and charging electric vehicles. Nationally, we're in an electricity crisis with reliable power plants shutting down far faster than they are being built. And the Biden EPA insanely plans to make things much worse with 7 policies that gravely threaten 10 to 20% of our reliable capacity in the next 7 years. So every one of these hundreds of actions the Biden administration is taking in terms of its whole of government approach is harmful to American businesses, including small businesses, who have to struggle with higher energy costs and lower reliability. Now, the final thing I want to address quickly is just the lie that solar and wind can rapidly replace fossil fuels. If this were true, they wouldn't need massive government preferences of their own, and they wouldn't need massive government punishments of fossil fuels. And if solar and wind could actually replace fossil fuels, China, which dominates the production of solar and wind components, wouldn't be using coal to produce these components, and they wouldn't have 300 planned new coal plants, more than all we have in the United States right now, to last over 40 years. So if you're thinking we're going to have more security with this stuff, we're not going to have much energy, and it's all going to be dependent on China. So what I want to encourage everyone here to do, particularly small businesses and politicians, pro-freedom politicians, is use your powerful voices to advocate for liberating all forms of energy, including fossil fuels, not limited to fossil fuels, so that America and the world can be a better place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Epstein. I now recognize Ms. Nisbet-Monsey for her 5-minute opening remarks. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chairman Hunt, Ranking Member Gluesenkamp-Perez, and members of the subcommittee for this opportunity to testify today. My name is Kathleen Nisbet-Monsey. I'm the COO of Goose Point Oyster. I'm a second-generation shellfish farmer and a mother to 5 children. Our company is located in the heart of Willapa Bay, Washington, where we own 2,000 acres of tidelands. Willapa Bay is one of 2 coastal estuaries in Washington that produce over 25% of the nation's oysters. The shellfish industry in Willapa Bay and the surrounding areas generates a tremendous economic impact. As the largest private employer in Pacific County, local shellfish farmers in Grays Harbor are responsible for nearly 2,000 family wage jobs and also contribute to over $102 million in economic impact. Shellfish farmers are while they're the largest private employer in our county, our tidelands are the backbone of our area. We are locally owned, and our tidelands are passed down from generation to generation. We have a family farm that has been farming there for over 150 years. Shellfish farming in Washington state actually predates statehood. As we continue to be the backbone of our community with local schools and also our jobs, it's not just what we do as shellfish farmers, it's our actual way of life. The ecosystem in which we farm is of utmost importance to us. As shellfish farmers depend on clean water and a healthy habitat, a single submerged oyster can filter up to 7 gallons of water an hour. Our responsibility is to protect that clean water. We are dedicated to managing the health of our ecosystems, and as a result, are regarded as one of the healthiest working estuaries in the U.S. I would actually promote stricter regulations on offshore energy, no matter what the company size is. Our oceans are extremely fragile environments, and shellfish farmers feel even the slightest changes in our ocean conditions. The most recent one we've been struggling with is ocean acidification. It came up in 2008, and according to NOAA, we are going to continue to see shifts in ocean acidification into the future. Some of the negative impacts of ocean acidification on farmers have been pH shifts, lack of calcium in the water, and harmful algal blooms. We must continue to provide for our waters and learn how to evolve with these changes instead of adding more complications with offshore energy. Along with more stringent regulations for offshore energy, there also must be adequate funds set aside for any disasters or even small leaks that would arise. The Gulf was not prepared for the oil spill, and the shellfish industry is still impaired due to it. We should learn from the mistakes and ensure that they don't happen again. An example is we are currently working with the state of Mississippi to be able to assist them in creating hatchery systems so they can rebuild their reefs down in Mississippi because the industry down there is still impaired today. And we have a sustainable farming mechanism in Willapa Bay, and they're trying to mimic that now down in Gulf states. So knowing how to do what we do in sustainable farming is also key for water quality and to be able to have a consistent food source across the boards. An oil spill off of our coast would destroy our estuaries and the communities that support it. Based on the way the waters work, we get 2 full tidal fluctuations of water a day. So anything that would happen off of our coastline would enter into our estuaries and have a significant impact on shellfish, crab, eelgrass, and other species that live there. Besides some of the local issues that would arise with offshore energy, our location also does not have any adequate services to respond to any sort of spill. The Wilpa Bay entrance and channels have not been properly managed for decades by the Department of Army Corps, and would pose a danger for any type of response team. There is really no positive scenario for our fragile ecosystems if there were to be any sort of spill off of our coastlines. Along with the impacts to shellfish in our coastal estuaries, we must also consider the Dungeness crab and salmon fishing communities. Shellfish tidelands are the rearing habitat for Dungeness crab and salmon. Dungeness crab fishing grounds are directly located off the Washington and Oregon coast. The access to these fishing grounds is currently limited, and any further limitations would risk the livelihood of the fleet, the communities that process and sell the seafood, and the current cumulative impacts to the fishing grounds would make it near impossible for future generations to be successful in the fishing industry. We should be focused on increasing seafood production in the U.S. instead of polluting the very waters that provide it. In conclusion, I would not support reduced regulations to offshore energy at the risk of the livelihoods of our rural communities. Shellfish is a sustainable seafood that has a huge benefit by providing ecosystem services, purifying the water, reducing carbon, and other essential ecosystem services to the areas in which we farm. Our fishing communities must be able to retain the available fishing grounds for the success of their industry. So we must stand up and protect the waters from contamination and be responsible stewards of the ecosystems in which we work in. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for being here. And again, I want to thank the witnesses. We now move to the member questions for the under 5-minute rule. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. First question for you, Mr. Menarvik. The financial assurance rule is said to be put in place to protect the taxpayers. Is there currently a real risk to the taxpayer to be held accountable for these costs? And if so, what would you propose as a solution?
Thank you, Chairman Hunt. You know, I think this is really important, and I've got a graphic, and I think it's in front of each of you that helps explain this little complicated issue. As Ranking Member Gusenkamp-Perez mentioned, the BOEM estimates that current abandonment obligations are, from their rule, $42.9 billion. I think her estimate was in the high 30s from a 2015 study. What you need to understand in order to understand the exposure to the taxpayer is it's broken up into these 3 buckets here. The green, dark green is investment-grade companies. The government is exempting that. Their numbers suggest that's $22.6 billion of the abandonment. The bottom number in red is non-investment grade companies, both current and prior owners, no investment grade company in the chain of title, $750 million. That's where we really need to focus our efforts here, and the GEA and Arena Energy support additional bonding associated with those less than investment grade companies. The thing that's really critical is the box in between, $19.5 billion. This is where a previous owner has an investment grade rating. And the thing is that the government has stated that under this proposed rule, the government retains the authority to pursue predecessor lessees for the performance of decommissioning obligation. When a company sells an asset, they remain in the chain of title. That's what protects the taxpayer. Any company that owns or previously owned leases is responsible. If Arena sold its assets to another company, we would stay in the chain of title and be responsible for that abandonment. That's what protects the taxpayer. So none of these dark green boxes or light green boxes should be considered for bonding. The only risk to the taxpayer is this red box, and that's what's really resulted in such a small loss relative to the exposure in the Gulf.
Thank you, sir. Next question is for you, Mr. Danos. American energy companies are leaders in innovation and produce the cleanest oil and gas in the entire world. I know I've been on these rigs. I've seen them actually personally. How would the rule on the Rice's whale and others like it affect the industry's ability to operate at its full capacity and reach its full potential?
Thank you, Chairman. It's a great question. Any new regulation needs to be, it needs to make sense. It needs to be balanced across all stakeholders and in terms of what it's trying to do, and it needs to be effective. And I think the Rice's whale, for instance, a couple notes about that. There's very little data that exists that we have the rhesus whale in the area that was originally pulled out of the last lease sale. So the balance, the effective components of that regulation just really didn't add up. And one thing related to marine operations that I think is really important to point out when we think about balancing the different stakeholders. Oftentimes in the Gulf of Mexico, what we do is we operate vessels at night so that we can do the higher risk work that we do on the platforms during the day. So with the rhesus whale regulation prohibiting vessels from moving at night, what you're doing is you're flipping that on its head. And the unintended consequence of that is that the people that work for my company and other small businesses and large businesses in the Gulf of Mexico, we're increasing the risk to those people with the work that they're doing, because they would have to move more of that work at night as opposed to doing it during daylight hours. And there's plenty of work that goes on at night, but we're increasing that exposure. So that's something that needs to be thoroughly examined and thought out as we proceed.
Thank you so much. Mr. Epstein, last question for you. What do you think of Biden's energy policy? And is it good for the country? You're allowed to take a little bit more time here if you like. I know I'm not going to let you do it in 45 seconds.
Well, no, I mean, I addressed a lot of it. I mean, the thing people need to get is the danger of this whole of government approach, because it's really has a terrorizing effect on industry, because industry knows that it's not just any given individual restriction that's a problem. It's that the government is literally trying to shut them down. You see this happening with coal right now, where the government is trying to shut down all of our coal plants. Which are preventing us from the abyss right now. We have catastrophic reliability problems, and now we have Mike Bloomberg, who I offered to publicly debate, so far hasn't stood up yet. Jordan Peterson offered to host, so Mike, let's do it. But he's spending $500 million on top of billions of other dollars to shut down our coal plants, and he's not willing to publicly defend it. One other thing, since the UAW is in the news right now, how are you going to get higher wages if you have Joe Biden pressuring companies to sell vehicles where they're losing billions of dollars? Companies don't give higher wages when they're losing billions of dollars due to forced policies by the government. So those are just two specific examples, but the whole of government approach is the overall disaster.
Thank you very much, and I recognize Ranking Member for 5 minutes worth of questions. Thank you, ma'am.
Ms. Nesbitt-Monsey, you highlighted in your testimony the vital role oysters play in filtering water in Willapa Bay. Can you explain the fragility in the system and the outcome to even minor changes in water quality?
Yes, I'd love to do so. So we are very sensitive. Since our oysters filter so much water through their systems, one of the most recent things that we've been seeing is HABs. There's been, due to climate change and ocean acidification, we are seeing an increase in harmful algal blooms into our estuaries. And any oyster that will filter a harmful algal bloom actually will die within like 2 to 6 weeks of that harmful algal bloom. So if you've got any sort of pollution that's coming into our waterways, oysters are going to be the first ones that receive that, and they'll have a negative impact directly associated with that. Once you take out oysters, then you'll lose your eelgrass, you'll lose habitat for Dungeness crab, and then you'll also lose habitat for salmon. So we've worked really hard with our upland owners of timber to make sure that we aren't having any runoff coming down into our estuary. And then we also work really hard with any upland owners with regards to homes to make sure no septic is coming into it, because we are very sensitive to any impacts on our water whatsoever.
So any minor spill would have a negative impact?
Any minor spill would have a significant impact.
So the fishing off the coast is an important implication of our economy alongside oyster fishing in the bay. Could you explain any form of offshore energy production in Washington endangers commercial fishing industry?
So currently, there's a limited amount of space that our commercial fishermen can already access. And so if you're going to put any sort of offshore energy, it will limit the ability that they have to fish in those grounds. So whether it's a platform, whether it's wind energy, or whether it's just cables that's underground, you've got Dungeness crab fisheries that are there that are at the base of that. And so if you take any of that ground away, then you're reducing their ability to fish in those areas. There's only a specific area that we can fish off of our coastline, and we must work to be able to have that managed efficiently so that we have food to produce in those areas. So we don't want to bring anything in that would impact those already limited areas for fishing.
Yeah, it feels like often, we were talking in the elevator on the way here, and we've talked, out in the bay, like the sense that like people assume there's nothing, like people from more urban communities or other parts, like, they assume nothing's going on. There's this arrogance of, like, there's nothing going on out there. Like, we'll just, like, move it somewhere where it's not in my view shed or it's somebody else's problem. And I think this loss of a sense of agency and determination in our rural communities, what happens here, how we prefer to make our livelihoods. So I'm deeply grateful for your advocacy of a way of life that I think is critical to our culture as Americans and as Washingtonians. Farming oysters is one of the most sustainable sources of seafood, not only purifying the water, but also absorbing and sequestering carbon emissions. Can you talk about the importance of sustainability broadly? This is not just about dollars and cents, but to your business and to your philosophy as a business owner.
Yeah. So for us, it's our way of life. We've always had the mentality that if you take care of the estuary, you take care of the bays in which you work in, that they'll take care of you. And so we sustainably farm our products. We have hatcheries, so we produce our own seed, we plant our seeds, we cultivate them, and then we harvest them. So our practice is it's not a wild fishery, it's very sustainable from that manner. And we're not just looking at it from the point of shellfish farmers, but everybody that works in and around and collaboratively in our ecosystems flourish. So we want to be able to retain the rights to be able to continue what we're doing for generations to come. And while it's been very difficult with climate change and OA, we need to figure out how to evolve. And that's one of the things that we've been huge proponents of, and make sure that we have a voice at the table. Because while there are rules that are made here in DC, like you guys are discussing today, I'm a small fish in a big pond, but the pond you can have impacts on that pond, and we're the ones that end up filtering it down at the most base level. So making sure that we are being smart with our regulatory side of things and knowing the impacts that they're going to have down the road, especially in rural communities, is key.
Mm-hmm. It feels like a lot of industries you can sort of take the money and run, but it feels like what I really value about our shellfish growers is, like, when you talk about the generational wealth, you are talking about the health of the estuary. That's where the money is. That's where the culture and the community is in the actual rootedness and health of your ecosystem. So I can't say how grateful I am to all the smart, hardworking people who have chosen to make and continue to make their family livelihoods in these rural communities. And thank you so sincerely. Thank you for taking time away from your family and your business to be here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I now recognize Representative Muser from the great state of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thanks. Thank you, Chairman, very much. Thank you very much to our witnesses for your work, your business, and for taking the trip, being here with us. Mr. Manarvovic, how do we pronounce that? Manarvic, thank you. You've got a business. You've got perhaps family members, and you got a small business, and that business is important to you?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we have small businesses here, some in the energy sector, some in other industries. I don't think it's up to this committee to decide who's more important. You know, that's just me. So this BOEM rule, when it perhaps goes into effect, what you called it existential.
Absolutely.
To you and to just reading here the billions of dollars and other small businesses that will be wiped out. Existential means wiped out.
Absolutely.
Okay, so is you're highly regulated business, obviously, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And have there been any problems lately? I mean, I come from the Marcellus Shale region, a new part of my district. You could go to a rig site, the level of regulation, which is great. That's how it should be in the United States. And even outdoor rig sites, it's like walking into a clean room.
Right.
It's perfect, right? There haven't been issues. So, and that's a good thing. There shouldn't be, and so that's the way it should be. So, in your business, I expect not abiding by some of the pollutant control requirements, which I'm all for, because this is the United States. We want to do things better than every other country. But if you were to cross those regulations, that would also be existential to your business, would it not?
Absolutely, yes, sir.
Okay. So this BOEM, we'll work on this because once again, these sort of government actions hurt those that supposedly it's trying to help. By increasing the level of bonds that you need to secure. What you expressed it in your opening testimony, but is it completely impossible? under the current
Yes, sir.
rules? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Let me respond to your first statement. It's absolutely the case that we're a heavily regulated industry. The Gulf of Mexico has been heavily regulated for 75 years, the federal waters of the Gulf of Mexico. And there's no better place to get our oil than the Gulf of Mexico.
Not Venezuela, not Russia?
It's going to be a lot cleaner coming from the Gulf of Mexico.
You think the Middle East, maybe you think they've got the same pollutant controls as the United States of America?
Let's get our barrels from the place where the states that surround it, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, and Louisiana, support it. Let's get our barrels from the place where the federal government gets a royalty check.
Venezuela, you think Venezuela's standards and are anywhere
Absolutely
near?
not.
We live in a round world, right?
Absolutely.
So those pollutants cause problems everywhere.
Ranking Member
Pretty much how it works.
Gusenkamp Perez said that, if people don't realize if you don't do it here, it's going to be done somewhere else. Things move around. If we're going to get our oil from somewhere, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, Iraq.
And what about the costs associated with all this? By losing our energy independence, forget about energy dominance.
Yes, sir.
Okay, with gasoline, $5 a gallon, $4 a gallon, $7 a gallon out in Pennsylvania, making us highly vulnerable to world events. I mean, man, we should have learned that when you and I were kids in the 70s, right? World events. I mean, Ukraine, you name it. OPEC decides to cut back, leaves us to completely wrecks our economy, causes inflation,
Absolutely.
or partially causes inflation, that and wildly excessive spending, hurts small businesses, hurts the oyster business, right? As your costs go way up, you just can't pass all that along. So, so I would say we're in a devolving initiative. What we should be focused on is energy dominance with the highest levels of pollutant controls. You could probably handle that, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, as opposed to having to follow this BOEM rule?
Absolutely, we need to do that. I mean, oil prices are being driven by supply and demand imbalances. Anything we do to restrict domestic production is going to have an impact on the world oil price ultimately, and that's going to be a regressive tax on the lower income people of this country. We need to move to alternatives. We need to move to all of the above. The best of the above is the right answer, and we need to pursue everything. But we can't limit fossil fuels. We're going to impair our country and our economy.
We're gonna go to work for you. Mr. Danos and then Mr. Epstein and then, I'm sorry, Miss, I should know, Miss Monsi. I'm running out of time, but I was just going to ask what came out of Washington that harmed you the most and what's come out of Washington that's helped you the most? And maybe we could follow up with that afterwards if we have a second round. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. I now recognize Representative Golden from Maine for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Monsi, I know most of the hearing is focused on oil and gas. I wanted to talk a little bit about BOEM and offshore wind development. As an oyster farmer specifically, do you have any concerns about offshore wind development and how it could impact local aquaculture operations?
Yes, I do. So the proposals that they're working off down in Oregon and off the Washington coast, we are not proponents of those. Our current cost for power that we have of hydro in the Northwest is about 4 cents per kilowatt hour that goes into our PUDs. The cost for wind would be about $1. So you're looking at a significant increase across the boards of a cost of power that would come to us in the Northwest. And there's been shown that there is zero net gain of wind energy off of our coastline. By the time you install it, you run it and you decommission it. So there's really no added benefit for our region to have offshore power. Our power center is already providing power to California and other sources. And it's a profit center associated with them. For the fishing grounds, you're looking at limiting the resources of the fishing grounds in our region and the cables associated with that. You're going to increase your traffic for cargo ships that are going to be there, for oil that's in there, for gas that's in the windmills, because it still needs to have all of that. So you're still risking our areas with those components because if you did have anything, it would come directly into our estuaries.
Do you have any concerns that it could also be potentially harmful to the ecosystem?
So any sort of spill with response, we have a really...
offshore wind, that is.
So offshore wind, because you still have to there's still diesel on those systems, and you still have to service them. So you're going to increase your boat traffic that goes in and around our area, and the risk of increased boat traffic and running aground. They've had several ships that have ran aground in the years over on the Columbia River Bar. And so if you increase that traffic to be more than what it currently is, you increase the risk, and we don't have a response. We currently don't have an adequate response team to the Willapa Bay entrance if there were to be any sort of spill.
For aquaculture communities and also fisheries in your region, do you feel like BOEM has been a good partner in hearing your concerns, or is there any evidence that they are working to address those concerns?
So in our region specifically, there hasn't been a direct nexus, no. Down in Southern Oregon, with the Crab Fishermen Association, there has been a nexus with BOEM.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I guess I'll try Mr. Epstein, but anyone else is welcome to try and answer this. And this is comes from a genuine place. So I'm not contesting that some of the policies you see coming out of the White House are concerning in regards to oil and gas production here domestically. You see some good things like approval of Willow up in Alaska, and then at the same time you see the cancellation of permits for leases up in Alaska. Sometimes going in the right direction, other times not. So at the same time, I've seen no shortage of reports that oil and gas production in the United States is up rather than down currently compared to, let's say, 2020. Is that true, or is that not true?
Well, so, I mean, 2020 is a very misleadingly
Sure, pick a year.
selected time.
Well,
so in general,
like I said, genuinely,
in general,
you pick your years. Is oil gas production in the United States up
it's
or down?
lower. Well, it just depends on your starting date, but it's up lower than it should be if we were free. So all of these things are, you guys have to look at it. What's the opportunity cost?
Sure.
So in this
I
case,
agree
we
with
have a global anti-fossil fuel movement that's trying to bring us to net zero, which essentially means the
Have
elimination.
we ever
of fossil
produced
fuels.
more oil and gas in the United States than we are today?
I'm not exactly sure year to year, but we are. The point is, we are. So if you look at what's happened by slowing the growth of oil and gas in a world that needs far more energy, we've caused a global energy crisis. And yet this administration and this global movement is trying to eliminate it. So the net zero movement hasn't even succeeded at reducing fossil fuels. They've only succeeded at slowing the growth. And already we have this huge vulnerability to the Russia-Ukraine situation. Already we have these cost increases. So that should be a wake-up call that this whole agenda is ill-conceived.
Yeah, no.
And if you want to address emissions, you should instead do so with energy freedom.
Just that I'm on your side, buddy. Like, I want all of the above. I want America to be an energy.
So will you condemn the Biden energy agenda?
I just told you. Wow, you're asking me questions now. It's like you came here with an agenda yourself, my friend.
I'm just a curious guy.
What I would say is that I think that this administration is governing over an increase in oil and gas production while simultaneously seemingly unwilling to celebrate that, which they should be celebrating. And I would agree with you that some of their policies, as I stated earlier, as an example, up in Alaska, are the wrong calls, and I would condemn that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I now recognize Representative Stauber from Minnesota for 5 minutes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for holding this hearing. You know, since taking office, President Biden has sought to shut down the oil and gas industry at every turn, putting our economy and energy security at risk. The week President Biden took office, gas on average was $1.87 a gallon in my home district in Minnesota. Today, it is nearing $4 a gallon, and President Biden did that. Rather than develop our abundant resources here safely, where we have the greatest environmental and labor standards, this administration would rather beg OPEC, Saudi Arabia, and others for more oil. This administration's motto on energy and mining is clear: anywhere but America, any worker but American. The Biden administration has completely neglected its duty to support oil and gas development and has failed to properly carry out an offshore leasing plan, even to the point that my Democratic colleagues had to force the Biden administration to do so in the Inflation Reduction Act last year. And still, this administration is failing to follow the law. Rather than offering a robust lease sale, this administration tried to subvert the law and pull millions of acres from the proposal for lease sale 261 due to unfounded concerns over the Rice's whale. Luckily, the Western District of Louisiana has intervened, in which Judge James Kane stated was, quote, a weaponization of the Endangered Species Act, end quote. After litigation and delay from this administration and the environmental activists, they teamed up with the courts, They teamed up with the courts and have directed the lease sale to move forward without the administration's ridiculous conditions by early November. I was proud to join Chairman Hunt and several of my Republican colleagues in filling an amicus brief in this case. Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a copy of this brief as well as a copy of the District Judge Kane's September 21st order.
Without objection.
Mr. Menarvik, can you share with the committee the history of transactions for offshore properties and how smaller producers like Arena Energy came to own properties they are developing in the Gulf of Mexico today?
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the question. It's very important to this rule. You know, as major oil companies developed this basin in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they installed thousands of platforms, 7,000 total, drilled 50,000 wells in the Gulf of Mexico. At some point, those assets deplete to a point that they're not important to those big companies, and they have a choice to produce them and develop them or to abandon themselves. Most of them chose to sell them in the marketplace. When a company decides to sell, it knows that it stays in the chain of title. There's no question about that. So it's well established in regs, law, and in practice. No one's fighting that by the companies that sold. And so when they do that, they sell to a private company like ours or a small public company. They put in a certain amount of protection, some bonding. A total of about $3 billion of additional private bonds are in place. For instance, Arena has about $600 million of abandonment obligations, and we have $400 million of private bonds. The rule that BOEM is proposing doesn't even account for that $400 million of bonds. And then additionally, the reason those bonds are put in place is because the seller, the bigger company, recognizes that they have an ongoing chain of title liability for abandoning those assets. So there's a negotiation that takes place. The selling company decides, do they want more insurance? Do they want more purchase price? Because the more insurance they want, the lower the purchase price. It goes back and forth. Ultimately, they decide what risk they want to take. The first thing they need to do is make sure they have a good buyer that's going to carry through on their obligations. But that's how it happens.
So what is a workable solution in your eyes, one that protects the American taxpayers from decommissioning liabilities without putting an undue burden on offshore operators? What's your
Well, it really falls out of what I just said on these transactions and goes back to that red box that I presented earlier. These are the properties that are really the taxpayer risk. We need to address those. We need to bond those. We need to make sure that the government is protected. We should not have taxpayer losses associated with those assets. And, you know, the SBA recognized this. And again, this is a small business subcommittee meeting, and the SBA said the BOEM should narrowly tailor this rule to cover only those liabilities for which there is no predecessor leaseholders that BOEM considers creditworthy. That's it. That fixes the problem right there.
Thank you. Mr. Danos, real quick, if lease sale 261 moved forward as the Biden administration and the environmental activists had hoped, what kind of impact would the conditions around the Rice's whale have on oil and gas companies' ability to operate in the Gulf of Mexico?
It would be significant. There's a significant portion of the lease sale that was carved out, and again, the question is we're making policy related to one sighting of one whale. So we are. Let me say this about the Rice's whale: the oil and gas industry is in favor of protecting the Rice's whale. There is a known habitat area for the Rice's whale that has protection, and we should maintain that. But what the area that we're carving out, or it's being carved out by the administration, is an area where there's not good science that the whale is there, and it's a huge impact.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My time's up, and I yield.
Thank you so much. I now recognize Chairman Williams from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank again the witnesses for being here today. And full disclosure, I'm a car dealer in Texas, so I guess I can say I deal with oil and gas quite a bit. And the Gulf of Mexico produces the cleanest barrels of oil on the planet. Instead of acknowledging that, this administration, the Biden administration, is more interested in virtual signaling and has placed burdensome regulations and attempted to restrict the sale of oil and gas leases in the Gulf. Mr. Menarvik, you highlight the irony that the compliance cost of the administration rules and the BOEM rule is, in particular, has required your company's capital to be used for compliance as opposed to decommissioning efforts. The question is, if regulation compliance costs were eliminated, could you elaborate on how your company would use this additional capital? Because we see this government regulating, taking capital away from what we can do and create jobs. So could you talk about that?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman Williams. This is an important issue. Obviously, every extra dollar that we spend on regulations, and there needs to be a level of regulations, but every extra dollar we spend on that is a dollar that we can't invest in these properties, continue their life, and also investment that we can make in decommissioning of these assets over time. And some of the issues that we got into over the last decade with 30 bankruptcies are related to overregulation of those companies and their inability to perform in that environment.
Yeah, one of the things that my colleague, Mr. Stauber, likes to talk about is since the Biden administration has come in with $375 billion worth of regulations and it put Main Street burden on 20 million man-hours of regulations. This is a real problem. This administration attempts to rapidly do away with and punish the use of fossil fuels as harming Americans. Mr. Epstein, you highlight that this attack on market really is anti-fossil fuel agenda. Without reliable fossil fuels, our electricity grid is in decline and failing in states like California, which is often under threat of rolling blackouts. So should the federal government adopt these policies at large, and what do you think will happen to the U.S. energy supply and our electric grid?
So should they adopt California energy policies? Oh, man. It's rough. I mean, you saw part of what happened in 2020 was we saw that other neighboring states were starting to import our policies, but they didn't realize we have a parasitical policy. So we shut down reliable power plants and then we depend on our neighbors. But the neighbors said, hey, we want to look good and we're going to do that too. But then we had a heat wave, the wind died down, of course, and then we didn't have enough power from our neighbors. So no, it's a parasitical thing. And in general, anyone who claims to be net zero or anything like that is lying. And these are not things that can scale at all. So we need to recognize that fossil fuels are essential for decades to come. And if you want alternatives, you need to do things like liberate nuclear, liberate mining. I think Representative Stauber knows. I mean, look at the Biden administration saying, hey, we've got an amazing mining property in Minnesota. Let's ban mining on that for 20 years and become even more dependent on China for crucial minerals. So we need energy freedom, not net zero.
All right. The Biden administration has prioritized regulations that hurt the United States energy security. That's what we're talking about. Mr. Danos, in your testimony, you highlight that the environmental stewardship and energy process are not mutually exclusive. So can you quickly elaborate on how you believe the Biden administration has missed the mark on this balancing act?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Williams. Again, we have a long history in the Gulf of Mexico of regulations that are common sense and support good production of affordable, low-cost energy, reliable energy, and we've worked that way together for a long time. And today, what we're seeing is the president getting up and saying that he wants to end production on federal lands, right? And this maybe goes back to why production is higher today. And Mr. Golden, it's a great question. Much of the increase in production is coming from state lands. A lot of that's coming from the Permian Basin in Texas. So those are not federal lands. And a lot of these investment decisions were years back, right? So what we need going forward is predictability and reliability so that those multi-million, even billion-dollar investments that will create higher production in the future, that we have that certainty going forward, and the regulatory environment is a big part of that.
In the time I got left, Ms. Mounsey, I'm from Texas, so I listened to your testimony. You got quite an industry. Do you also, in your industry, run into the regulations, this massive amount of regulations the Biden administration is putting on Main Street America? I'm in the car business. We see it in the oil industry. Do you see it too in your industry, the regulations?
We have seen regulations change in our industry as well. Yes.
And probably affects the cost of goods sold for you too.
We do have impacts associated with that.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield my time back. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we're good here. We're not going to do another round, if I'm not mistaken. And I want to thank you all so much for being here. I want to say this. Ms. Mounsey, thank you so much for being here. I've learned a lot about your industry. I actually had no idea. This is why I love this job. And I've been on Mr. Menarvich's rigs. I've spoken to you, sir. We've done interviews together in the past, and I'd love to come see your operation as well to learn more about it and to see exactly how we can all coincide and live together. What's really important to us and what's really important to me is, as you've heard from these gentlemen, is an all-hands-on-deck approach is what's necessary. We cannot restrict any electrons. End of discussion. This is not up to the government to pick winners and losers. This is about supplying not just the United States, not just Texas where I'm from, not just California, but supplying the entire world with affordable, clean, and abundant energy from our country that does it better than anywhere else in the entire world. I'm somebody that spent 2 years in Saudi Arabia when I was deployed there, and they have an abundance of resources there, let me tell you. But I was also told that the Marcellus Shale is actually known as the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. To put that in perspective, there's no such thing as an endless amount of fossil fuels, but Saudi Arabia is pretty doggone close to it. And the fact that we are sitting on the Marcellus Shale, part of it runs into New York, and we can't drill for any of it, is actually ridiculous. We, as a country, have got to get out of our own echo chamber and we forget sometimes that in this country, we have champagne problems. I can tell you that China and India, Taylor Swift is pretty popular right now. Oh, Tay-Tay. I feel sorry for Travis right now. But we do. And if you look at what's happening in China, India, Russia, a lot of these countries of the Middle East, OPEC countries, Iran, they really don't care about the world's climate at all. I'm a military guy. I've seen it. This country cares immensely. And while we should continue to lead from the front in this, we also have got to realize that we are the bridge. Oil and gas, natural gas, energy, we are the bridge, and it's everything. I've visited almost every single energy company in my districts, and there's a lot of them. And I can tell you I have never heard a single executive say anything disparaging about renewable energy. I've heard nothing but actually, I want to reinvest in it. Let's talk more about nuclear. Let's talk more about hydrogen. I've heard nothing but those things. And I can attest to that. It's genuine. It's real. It's not just corporate big oil trying to spin off their ideas for world dominance because they really want to keep this going forever. These companies are actually literally investing in these renewable energy sources because I've seen their books and I've seen what they're trying to actively do. I just want to make sure that we are smart about it, that we are savvy about it, and we do it in a way where I can continue to eat oysters because I love oysters. I had some last night, and I'm not going to stop eating. And no, I do not want to ruin your business and your ecosystem for your small business. And I also, sir, want you to continue to strive to provide reliable and clean energy for our country. So with that said, thank you all so much for being here. Greatly appreciate it. I think at some point we will have you back. To me, this is the most important issue that we are facing in our world today. And without objection, members have 5 days to submit additional materials and written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses. I ask the witnesses to please respond promptly. If there's no further business without objection, the committee is adjourned, and thank you so much.